The day I found my son rifling through my jewelry box, I knew 43 years of motherhood had led me to this moment of reckoning. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Margaret, and at 72, I thought I had seen everything life could offer a woman like me. I was wrong. After my husband Robert died 5 years ago, I became what people politely call a widow of means. Robert had been prudent with money, and between his life insurance and our paid-off house, I was comfortable enough to maintain my independence and help my children when needed. My son David, now 45, had always struggled to find his footing. While his sister Sarah built a successful career, David bounced between jobs and seemed to view each setback as evidence that the world owed him something better. When Robert was alive, he had been firm with David about expectations. But after the funeral, something in me softened. David was going through a difficult divorce, struggling with child support payments, and I watched him spiral into depression. So when he asked to move back home temporarily, I said yes. Temporary stretched from weeks into months, then years. David made sporadic attempts to find work, but there was always some reason why each job did not work out. Meanwhile, I found myself covering his car payments, credit card bills, and child support. I told myself, this was what mothers do. We support our children through difficult times. At 70 years old, surely I could afford to be patient and generous. The pattern became so gradual I barely noticed how my life began shrinking around David's needs. He would sleep until noon, then expect breakfast. He complained when I made plans with friends because he needed my car. When I suggested applying for jobs outside his preferred field, he became defensive and accused me of not believing in his potential. Most troubling was how he spoke to me during his frustrations. When interviews went poorly, David would vent his anger in ways that made me feel small and foolish. He criticized how I managed finances, suggesting I was too old to understand modern banking and should let him handle the accounts. He rolled his eyes at my struggles with technology, making comments about how much easier everything would be if I admitted I needed help. I began to notice friends calling less. When I mentioned this to David, he said they were probably dealing with their own problems. He suggested that at my age, it was natural for social circles to shrink, and wasn't it nice that we had each other? The first time I found money missing from my purse, David had a ready explanation. He had borrowed $40 for gas and forgotten to mention it. When it happened again, he looked confused and suggested perhaps I had miscounted. After all, memory issues were common at my age, and stress could make them worse. That phrase became a refrain whenever I questioned discrepancies. Memory issues. Stress. My age, always delivered with concern, as if David was protecting me rather than undermining my confidence. David began hinting that I should make him primary beneficiary on my accounts. After all, Sarah had her career and did not need the money the way he did. Besides, wasn't he taking care of me in my old age? The conversation about power of attorney came during a minor health scare. David used my emergency room visit to suggest I might need someone to help make decisions if my health declined. He made it seem like simple planning. I found myself agreeing to things I had not intended to agree to, simply because David presented them as obvious necessities. When had I become so passive in my own life? The day I discovered David in my bedroom, going through my jewelry with my grandmother's engagement ring in his hand. Everything clicked into focus with brutal clarity. I had returned early from a doctor's appointment to find David's door closed and music playing loudly. Assuming he was asleep, I went to change clothes. That is when I found him crouched beside my dresser, jewelry scattered across the bed, examining pieces like an appraiser. We stared at each other. David's face cycled through surprise, embarrassment, then defiance, as if I was the one intruding. "Mom," he said in that patient tone I had heard so often, "I was just organizing your jewelry. Some of these pieces are valuable, and you keep them in this old box, where anyone could take them. I was thinking we should get them appraised." But my grandmother's ring was in his palm, and his phone showed what looked like an auction website with similar rings and price estimates. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything we had ever had. David became defensive, then angry, then manipulative. He accused me of not trusting him, of becoming paranoid, probably because of my age. He said Sarah had been filling my head with doubts. When I asked directly if he had been planning to sell my jewelry, David looked me in the eyes and lied smoothly. "Of course not," he said. "But maybe it would be smart to know what everything was worth for insurance. And honestly, some pieces would be better off going to his daughters anyway." That night, I sat in my kitchen, feeling as if I was seeing my life from a great distance. How had I allowed myself to become a resource to be managed, rather than a person to be respected? How had my desire to help transform into enabling manipulation of my kindness? I thought about Robert and what he would say if he could see how I had handled things. He had loved David but never allowed our son to treat us as means to an end. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that loving someone does not require accepting disrespectful treatment. The next morning, I made decisions about my own life, without consulting David. First, I drove to the bank and removed David's name from my checking account. The banker was professional but kind, and when she asked if I was sure, I realized it was the first time in months someone had asked for my preference about my own money. Next, I visited my lawyer to review the power of attorney documents. My attorney took one look and asked if I had intended to give David such broad authority. When I admitted I had not fully understood the scope, he suggested we revise the documents to be more limited. That afternoon, I called Sarah. My daughter listened without interruption, and I heard something unexpected in her voice. Relief. "Mom," she said, "I have been so worried about you. But every time I tried to bring up concerns about David, you defended him. I could see how tired and stressed you looked whenever we talked." Sarah helped me understand that my desire to avoid conflict had enabled David to avoid natural consequences of his choices. By consistently rescuing him, I had prevented him from developing skills and motivation to solve his own problems. When David came home and discovered his bank access was revoked, his reaction was immediate and intense. He accused me of sabotaging his efforts, of listening to Sarah's poison, of becoming cruel and selfish in my old age. But something had shifted. I listened to David's accusations and felt nothing. Not guilt, not the urge to apologize, not familiar anxiety about his disappointment. Instead, I felt curious about why he believed his needs created obligations for me that my own security did not. I told David he had 30 days to find alternative housing. I offered to help research apartments and social services, but I would no longer fund his lifestyle while he pursued vague career dreams. David alternated between fury and emotional manipulation. He accused me of abandoning him, suggested I was becoming mentally unstable, and threatened to contest my legal changes, claiming I was not competent. But I had learned something from my conversations with the banker and lawyer. Other professionals treated me as a competent adult, capable of informed decisions. Their respect helped me recognize how dramatically David had undermined my confidence. The 30 days were difficult. David made sure I understood exactly how much inconvenience his departure would cause him. He cataloged every sacrifice he claimed to have made for my benefit. He would disappear for days, then return with stories about sleeping in his car or staying with friends temporarily. When I did not offer to extend his deadline, he seemed genuinely surprised. I realized David had become accustomed to my predictable responses to his distress. This time, I offered to help him contact housing resources, but I did not offer to let him stay. 2 weeks before David's deadline, I received a call from a social worker specializing in elder care. David had contacted her office with concerns about my mental state and ability to live independently. The social worker was thorough in questioning me about daily routines, household management, social connections, and financial understanding. As we talked, I realized David's narrative about my declining capabilities bore no resemblance to my actual life. I was managing my household efficiently, maintaining health appointments, staying connected with friends, and making informed financial decisions. The only area where I had experienced confusion was in my relationship with David himself. The social worker concluded I showed no signs of cognitive decline or inability to live independently. She did express concern about what sounded like financial exploitation by a family member, and provided resources for older adults dealing with manipulation by relatives. When I confronted David about contacting social services, he was unrepentant. He insisted he was protecting me from decisions I would regret. On the day David finally moved out, he made one last attempt to change my mind. He appeared in my kitchen, looking vulnerable and defeated, and began to cry. "Mom," he said, "I know I have not been the son you wanted. I know I have disappointed you and Dad, but I am trying to change, and I just need more time and support. Please do not give up on me." For a moment, I felt the familiar pull of maternal protectiveness. But then I thought about the social worker's questions and my honest answers. I thought about how much energy I had devoted to managing David's emotions while neglecting my own health and peace of mind. I told David I loved him and would always be his mother, but our relationship needed to change for both of us to be healthy. I could not continue enabling his avoidance of adult responsibilities, and he could not continue treating me as a resource rather than a person. David left that afternoon without saying goodbye. The silence felt strange at first. For 3 years, I had organized my days around David's schedule and needs. Now, I had to remember what I wanted for my own life. I started small. I rearranged furniture according to my preferences, bought groceries based on foods I wanted, reconnected with neglected friends, and accepted social invitations I had previously declined. Most surprisingly, I began sleeping better than I had in years. I had not realized how much stress I had been carrying about David's problems. Without constant anxiety about his next crisis, I felt more rested and energetic. 3 months later, Sarah visited for a long weekend. She commented on how different I seemed, more like the mother she remembered from before Dad died. We talked honestly about family dynamics that had allowed David's behavior to continue unchecked. Sarah admitted she had struggled with resentment about my financial support for David, while she worked hard to build her own career. She felt her responsible choices were being ignored, while David's irresponsible ones were being rewarded. 6 months after David left, he called. His voice was different, less demanding and more uncertain. He had found a job, not in his preferred field, but one providing steady income and benefits. He was sharing an apartment with a roommate and learning to manage finances more carefully. He did not apologize for his behavior, but he acknowledged that living independently had been more challenging than expected. He said he was beginning to understand why I had insisted on boundaries. We began brief phone conversations every few weeks. The conversations were cordial, but not particularly warm. We were both learning how to have a relationship that did not revolve around his needs and my responses. 1 year after David moved out, I received an unexpected visitor. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, knocked on my door looking distressed. Her adult son had been pressuring her to sign documents giving him control over her finances. As Mrs. Chen described her situation, I recognized the same patterns I had experienced. I shared some of my experience, focusing on helpful resources and professionals who had provided objective perspective. I did not tell her what to decide, but helped her understand she had options. 2 years after David moved out, he called to tell me he was engaged. His fiancée was a nurse with 2 teenage children from a previous marriage. David spoke about her with genuine respect and affection. He also mentioned attending counseling to work on communication skills and relationship patterns. His therapist had helped him understand how his behavior had affected family relationships. For the first time since childhood, David asked about my life rather than simply updating me on his situation. He inquired about my health, activities, and whether I was happy living alone. I told him about volunteer work, my book club, friendship with Mrs. Chen, and a trip to Ireland I was planning with Sarah. As I described my current life, I realized how full and satisfying it had become once I stopped organizing it around someone else's dysfunction. David was quiet, then said I sounded happier than I had in years, and that he was glad I was taking care of myself. It was not an apology, but it was acknowledgement that our previous arrangement had not been healthy for either of us. 3 years after David moved out, Sarah and I took our trip to Ireland. We visited the county where my grandmother had been born, and talked about family patterns passed down through generations. Standing in the Irish countryside, I felt connected to something larger than my own family's problems. These women had survived hardships by being strong because they had to be, not because someone made it easy for them. I realized my strength had been depleted during years when I tried to make David's life easy rather than challenging him to develop resilience. By absorbing consequences of his choices, I had prevented him from building character that comes from facing difficulties. When I returned home, David called asking about the trip. He listened with interest, then asked if I would like to meet his fiancée when they visited. When they arrived, I was impressed by Jennifer's straightforward manner and competence. She worked full-time, managed her finances, and had raised her children as a single mother. More importantly, I observed how David behaved in her presence. He was attentive without being manipulative, helpful without being condescending. He treated her as an equal partner. During their visit, David mentioned Jennifer had been surprised by some of his relationship assumptions. She had helped him understand that loving someone did not mean solving all their problems, and accepting help did not mean becoming dependent. That evening, David and I sat on my porch talking. He said that at the time, my decision to stop supporting him had felt like abandonment. But looking back, he could see his dependence had prevented him from building the life he actually wanted. David told me he was grateful Jennifer had never offered to solve his problems, because it forced him to develop confidence in his abilities. He wished he had learned those lessons earlier. It was the closest thing to an apology I had received from David, and it felt genuine. More importantly, it suggested he had gained insight into patterns that had damaged our relationship. 4 years after David moved out, I celebrated my 76th birthday, surrounded by friends from book club, neighbors like Mrs. Chen, and family members who treated me with respect. David and Jennifer attended, bringing thoughtful gifts and contributing to conversation without dominating it. As guests were leaving, Mrs. Chen mentioned how much she had enjoyed meeting David. She said he seemed like a nice young man who clearly cared about his mother. I realized this was true, but differently than during years of manipulation and dependency. David now cared about my well-being, rather than just my willingness to solve his problems. 5 years after David moved out, I received a modest inheritance from my uncle. I decided to use it to fund a scholarship at the community college for students starting over later in life. When I told David about the scholarship, he was genuinely touched. Then he asked if he could contribute to the fund as well, not a large amount, but something meaningful from his own earnings. I realized David's offer represented something important. He was choosing to give something of value to help others, rather than constantly seeking to receive help for himself. 6 years after David moved out, I am approaching my 78th birthday with satisfaction I could not have imagined during those difficult years. My relationship with Sarah has evolved into something based on mutual respect and shared interests. We travel together, share books, and support each other through normal life challenges. My relationship with David has become something I never expected but deeply appreciate. We talk regularly, focusing on genuine connection rather than problem solving. He asks about my activities with sincere interest. Most importantly, I have learned to trust my own judgment again. The years of being told I was too old or confused had eroded my confidence. Now I make choices based on my own assessment rather than others' opinions. I think often about the woman I was 6 years ago, exhausted by maintaining a relationship that was slowly destroying both participants. That woman believed she was being loving and patient, but she was actually enabling dysfunction. The woman I am now understands that real love sometimes requires difficult decisions. Sometimes loving someone means refusing to rescue them from consequences of their choices. I have learned that being alone is different from being lonely, and that having people who take more than they give is lonelier than having fewer people who treat you with genuine care. When Mrs. Chen comes for tea, we talk about books and memories. When Sarah calls, we discuss family news and her challenges. When David contacts me, he shares updates and asks thoughtful questions about my life. These relationships nourish rather than deplete me, because they are based on mutual giving and receiving rather than one-sided caretaking. As I write this, I am planning another trip with Sarah and considering taking a watercolor painting class, something I always wanted to try but never made time for during years when other people's needs took priority. David recently told me he and Jennifer are expecting their first child together. He asked if I would be willing to provide occasional babysitting once the child is old enough. I told him I would be happy to spend time with my grandchild, but would not be available for regular childcare responsibilities. I had learned the importance of maintaining boundaries around my time and energy. David accepted this boundary without argument. He said he understood I had my own life to live, and they would make their own childcare arrangements. His response confirmed how much he has grown in understanding healthy relationship dynamics. Looking back over these 6 years, I am struck by how much energy I wasted trying to control outcomes I had no power to influence. What I could do was control my own responses to other people's choices. Most importantly, I learned that changing my own behavior was the only reliable way to change relationship dynamics. When I stopped enabling David's dependence, he was forced to develop independence. The woman I am now would not recognize the woman I was 6 years ago. That woman was generous to a fault and utterly depleted. This woman is still generous, but she has learned to direct those qualities toward people who deserve them. I have learned that self-preservation is not selfish, that boundaries are not cruel, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst impulses. At 78, I am finally living a life that reflects my own values rather than other people's expectations. It took longer than I wished to learn these lessons, but I am grateful to have learned them while I still have time to benefit. The sound of my grandmother's ring against the jewelry box every morning reminds me that some things are worth protecting, and that I am one of them.